Thank you for joining us. My name is Rafael Fonseca. I'm a hematologist and oncologist, and today I will have a conversation with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jeff Singer. Jeff, welcome.
Happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So I've been looking forward to this for quite some time, and you've become quite an expert and a national figure when it comes down to understanding the current problem we have with opioids. And I'm reserving terms because I know you have some very specific thoughts, about how we should refer to the crisis that we're seeing and the issue related to the overdose deaths that unfortunately we have seen in the United States. So if you don't mind, why don't we start a little bit just with a quick background? How did you get into this, and how did you start becoming involved in the topic of opioids?
Well, as a practicing general surgeon for about 40 years, obviously I treat patients who need opioids both for malignant problems and benign problems, post-surgical pain, for pain due to cancer, just like you do. So I'm very familiar with dealing with pain and prescribing opioids. I'm also a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and as a person who's always interested in public policy, as the opioid issue has become more prominent, I've been one of the tasks I've been given at the Cato Institute is to use my expertise as a physician to dig into that issue and give my perspectives on it. So that's basically how I got involved in
it. And we'll try to unpack a little bit what's going on, because people like you and I am concerned as well too, is that the current narrative is not really leading us towards solutions. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Clearly, this is not a new problem, but it's something that has been exacerbated over the past several years.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me a little bit, before we go into the details of the current situation, a little bit of the background of opioids, and how did we get here, and what were some of the key moments you think that led to first the increased use of opioids, and then what might be some of the consequences of those decisions?
Sure. Well, of course, right now the narrative that is reverberating in an echo chamber that politicians, policymakers, and the media seem to all be trapped in, has it that the opioid overdose problem we have today is primarily a result of greedy pharmaceutical companies influencing doctors to overprescribe opioids to patients, who then became hooked on opioids and became trapped in this nightmare of addiction. And that's at the heart of the opioid overdose crisis. And if we can just get those doctors to prescribe less opioids, then we can stop addicting our population. That's pretty much what's been driving policy for the past 8 to 10 years. In fact, it's definitely off the mark. If you look at history, as early as the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, there were many scholarly articles published in peer-reviewed journals by clinicians and academic healthcare practitioners that showed that, number one, we were under-medicating patients in pain because, and this largely grew out of the war on drugs. All of us were sort of, both the doctors and the patients were taught to fear opioids. In fact, the term opiophobia has been coined. There was a lot of evidence suggesting that, number one, opioids in the medical setting have a low addictive potential. They have a low propensity to overdose. They're actually relatively safe. They have a very remarkably high median lethal dose, and therefore doctors were being too frugal in making patients suffer needlessly. But like I had said, it was on both sides of the bed. So I remember many times in the early years of my practice, I'd be making post-op rounds on my patient who would be clearly in pain, and I'd say, I have pain medicine over for you. Just ring the bell, and the nurse would bring in morphine, and the patient would say, no, I don't want to become addicted. So they would make themselves suffer too. And then, of course, we doctors had been products of the war on drugs, so we were being restricted. But then these studies were suggesting we need to loosen up. And by the mid to late 80s, even the National Institute on Drug Abuse was publicly saying that there's this myth surrounding the danger of opioids that is actually causing people to be unnecessarily undertreated for pain. So even going into the early 90s, there were many professional associations and societies calling on us doctors to revisit our attitude about opioids. Finally, in 1996, the American Pain Society suggested that we make pain the fifth vital sign. That, in other words, instead of just taking vital signs of temperature, pulse, blood pressure, respiration rate, also ask the patient how much pain they're in. We should pay attention to pain. So by the mid to late 90s, it became the way we practice changed, and the way attitudes of patients became more relaxed about taking opioids because we were telling them they can relax. Now, a lot of the current advocates of our restrictive policy towards the opioid problem point to one letter to the editor in 1980 in New England Journal of Medicine by Porter and Zick. And they say this letter to the editor was shown by sales reps for the opioid manufacturers and overemphasized to convince doctors to prescribe opioids. And it was just a letter to the editor. It wasn't a peer-reviewed study. Well, actually, to be fair, the letter then referred to two peer-reviewed studies that the authors had done that had been published in 1978 and in 1971 on thousands and thousands of hospitalized patients followed in the Boston University Collaborative. But be that as it may, it may be true that a lot of pharmaceutical representatives, in fact, it is true, it's been shown, a lot of pharmaceutical representatives were unscrupulous, they were over selling and downplaying some of the risks because they were trying to make sales. And that's not, I'm not excusing them, that's not excusable.
Sure.
In 1996, OxyContin came on the scene. Up until then, among the most popular drugs for people to abuse were oxycodone and hydrocodone, Vicodin. They would get what people who were regulators called diverted into the black market. So diverted, you can steal medicine from the medicine cabinet, you can shop around different doctors, pretend you're in a lot of pain to get some prescriptions so you can sell them. You can rob pharmacies, you can rob warehouses. So these pills would get diverted, and they were the most popular ones. In 1996, Purdue Pharma developed OxyContin, which is a long-acting oxycodone, where the idea was you don't have to take it as frequently because it's concentrated and slow release. It quickly became known to the non-medical users, the people accessing drugs in the black market, that OxyContin is a great drug to abuse because if you crush it and snort it or liquefy it and inject it, you're getting a much more potent dose than you would if you're just dealing with regular oxycodone or Percocet. So that suddenly became one of the more popular ones to try to get your hands on if you were going to be a non-medical user. It's true that, and Purdue Pharma has already admitted to this and paid significant penalties for it. The FDA has to even approve the script that the sales representatives use when they visit doctors to tell them about their product. And the script they approved said that it is not known yet whether OxyContin may have a decreased risk for addiction, but it's hoped that it will. Something to that effect. But it was clear that it was not yet decided, but it was hoped that that could be a beneficial effect. But apparently a lot of sales reps out in the field were saying it has a lower addiction potential. So that's not allowed. That's what they call misbranding. So that was going on. And meanwhile, it became very publicly known, there were several doctors who operated what's called pill mills. These are unscrupulous doctors, unethical doctors who basically are drug dealers. They're using their medical degrees as a cover. And you go to their office and you give them $100 and you tell them while you're in pain, wink, wink, and they give you a prescription. And then you go and you have your friend come in right after you, et cetera, and then you go sell those things. And in some cases, the doctors were even taking a piece of the action. Well, this isn't the way the majority of doctors are. These are bad apples, and there are bad apples in every field. So for the most part, they've been, in fact, to my knowledge, they've all been rolled up by the police, by the DEA, by law enforcement, and been eradicated. But by the early 2000s, we were starting to see rising overdose rates. And by 2010, the CDC told us that the amount of opioid prescriptions in circulation had quadrupled since
Sure.
1999. So it's understandable how policymakers would connect the increased number of prescriptions and the increased number of overdoses, and then these bad doctors who were rolled up, and you can see how it would be easy to lock into, okay, so these bad doctors are getting our people hooked on opioids. So not only did they arrest those doctors, but then the focus became, how do we get people to prescribe, how do we get doctors to prescribe less opioids? And by around 2010, almost every state had instituted these surveillance programs, prescription drug monitoring programs, where they're letting doctors know that they're being watched. And they're monitoring you for your prescription patterns. And if you're a quote-unquote outlier, you can get a visit from the Drug Enforcement Administration, and you have to defend yourself in court because they're going to accuse you of being one of those doctors operating the clinics. Patients as well will be monitored. The whole goal was to get doctors to prescribe less opioids, and that'll solve the problem because opioids are the cause of the problem. And so the opiophobia that had governed our medical profession and medical practice in the 60s, 70s, and 80s now returns. We had overcome it, now we're back to it big time. But meanwhile, where are we at today? So since 2010, we've got those prescriptions down. In fact, prescriptions of high-dose opioids, which is 90 morphine milligram equivalents per day or greater, they've dropped over 41% since 2010, according to the CDC. And overall prescription, just in the last year, prescription of opioids in general have dropped 22%. All opioids, not just high-dose opioids. And the National Survey on Drug Use and Health tells us that non-medical use of prescription opioids peaked in the year 2012. And in the year 2014, total opioid use, medical and non-medical, was less than it was in 2012.
Wow.
But what's happening to the overdose rate? The overdose rate last year was 20% higher than the year before. And if you look at the distribution of the overdoses, it's now become predominantly a heroin and fentanyl crisis. Fentanyl overdoses have increased at a rate of 88% a year since 2013. Heroin overdoses have increased at a rate of 19% a year since 2014. Up until then, they were increasing at a rate of 33% a year between 2010 and 2013. And meanwhile, if you look at the overdose rate for prescription type opioids, that curve has been pretty much flat to stable, 3% a year since 2009. So a rational person has got to start thinking, well, maybe it's not the number of prescription opioids out there that's driving this thing.
So let me take it out from there. I think one of the things that bothers me, and I know it's bothered you, and obviously you're a breath of fresh air when it comes down to doing data analysis of the problem, is that people avoid the nuance, right? Like you want to go down to the details, and you know, there's a lot of material of what you just said that I'd like to probe a little bit further. But I mean, the reality, this is a very serious problem. But if we are to find solutions, we obviously need to know what the root cause of the problem is, and it just seems to me, given what I see, that people are not really doing that. These are superficial answers, and at best they're going to be ineffective. At worst, they will make things worse. I think you make a good case for that. But just for our audience, let me take us back to the first concept. Okay, so one of the problems is terminology and how nuanced we are about what's going on. And so you started with the word addiction. Can you make distinction of what people refer to when they talk about addiction? I know this is a very important concept that you point out on your previous conversations.
That's very important because most politicians and policymakers and media people tend to use the word addiction and chemical dependency interchangeably. And two different things. Doctors have known this for decades. Chemical dependency or physical dependency is associated with lots of different medications. But with opioids, this simply means that as you've been on it for a while, your body gets used to it, and you need oftentimes increasing doses to achieve the desired effect because you develop intolerance. And then if you abruptly stop it, you go into withdrawal symptoms. And I've had numerous patients over the years who, because of the type of surgical problem they had to be on some sort of opioid for a while.
Sure.
And then they would tell me, they'd call me up and say, I haven't been taking my pain meds because I'm not in pain, but I'm feeling sick, I'm getting sweaty and nauseated, having diarrhea. And I would tell them, you know, you probably developed a chemical dependency to the opioids, you go through withdrawal. In fact, when we go through, we get a hangover after a night of heavy drinking, that's a form of alcohol withdrawal that you experience. And what we have always done over the years, I'm sure you have in your practice as well, is when we recognize that, then we work with it. It's our responsibility as doctors. We work with our patient. We say, okay, let's taper you off this. Let's get you on a smaller dose, maybe even switch you to a different type of opioid. And over the next couple of weeks, we'll just get you tapered off and end of story.
You know, I'm dealing with that in my clinical practice. So my practice is primarily patients with multiple myeloma. They have bone fractures or bone disease. Many of them have very, very serious pain. And I think 5 years ago, it was quite simpler to engage in the process of prescribing and doing so properly under standard medical sort of parameters of what's appropriate. Now, nowadays, I find there's a much greater reluctance by patients, and oftentimes encouraged by well-intentioned and caring family members when we bring up the idea of, well, maybe your pain is of such severity that we should use an opioid. Start seeing the eyebrows being raised, and do we really need to go that route? So
return to the opiophobia of the 70s.
Yeah, at the very least, we go back to spending a little bit more time having to explain how an opioid prescription might be an appropriate thing for a patient. And one of the things I tell them, it's rare that this happens. And I know you have very good academic data on the rate of people becoming addicted or having addictive behavior too.
Now, addiction is on a molecular level is a completely different disease. It's a disorder where the case that we just discussed, the patient you tapered off, they're done. Once they're tapered off, end of story. And I've had a number of patients when we're discussing an elective operation, they'll ask me, what pain medicine do you want to prescribe for me? And what I tell them is, last time I got dependent on that and I hated that experience, can we try something else? And that's not an addict, okay? An addict is a person who, even when they've been detoxed, they're craving that substance. They'll make self-destructive choices in their life because they need that substance. Even years after, when we have heroin addicts who are imprisoned and they're detoxed, unfortunately, the cruel way, just left alone to
cold
turkey. And then they get out of jail, let's say 2 years later. The first thing they do is try to find their contact to get some heroin. That's an addict. That's a mental health disease. There's a lot of research on it, and there's still a lot to be known, but there's definitely a genetic component. In fact, Dr. Nora Valkow, the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, says there's something like about a 40% genetic component to it. But just because you have those genetic predispositions, and you'll see it run in families, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll become an addict. In fact, again, quoting the National Institute of Drug Abuse, Dr. Valkow and McClellan, that opioids prescribed in a medical setting, even to people with pre-existing vulnerabilities, have a very low addictive potential. Usually the people who become addicted, there are other factors as well, traumas in life. You'll hear stories over and over again, people who were molested or abused. They have depression. There are a lot of other psychological factors that kind of interact, and they have like a synergy with this pre-existing condition.
So I know you often cite a Cochrane study of the very low rate of addiction, right? But that kind of brings together a lot of studies, and this is a very important message, because I'm not even sure, quite frankly, if everyone in the medical community realizes that there's a very low potential for this addictive.
In fact, the advocates of our current policy, people like Governor Christie, Attorney General Sessions, they keep saying, those doctors lied to us. They told us, and the pharmaceutical companies told us that it had a very low addictive potential. That letter to the editor in New England Journal of Medicine said probably less than 1%. Well, that's the truth. It is probably less than 1%. Just recently, some studies, Cochrane analysis in 2010, another one in 2012, in chronic non-cancer pain patients on prescription opioids, found a roughly 1% addiction. Now, we're not talking about chemical dependency, we're talking about addiction rate. And then just this year, in January, a study from researchers at Harvard and Johns Hopkins did a very good study. Looked at 568,000 patients given opioids for acute post-surgical pain between the years 2008 and 2016. That's a long stretch, and they're all in the Aetna data bank, so they were able to keep a look at really keep track of the data. they found a total misuse rate. Now, misuse there's a spectrum, anywhere from not using it for what it was prescribed, like prescribed for surgical pain, we used it for toothache. Anywhere from that to addiction, total misuse rate of 0.6%. And then another thing of note, and this is why I think they were off base, they kept thinking that we were addicting our patients. From the start, from the get-go, it's always been non-medical users accessing drugs in the black market. And the black market is there because we have drug prohibition. So a study that gets very little attention came out in 2009.
That's almost 10 years ago,
yeah,
2009.
It was before they really started getting serious about addressing this politically.
Sure.
2009, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. They looked at 27,000 patients who are entering rehab for OxyContin addiction. Okay, these are OxyContin addiction. They found that 78% of them said they never sought this from a doctor. These were non-medical users. 86% said they were taking the OxyContin because they liked the buzz and the high, not for pain.
Sure.
And 77% had a history of prior substance abuse and treatment for substance abuse disorders. They also had a history of polydrug use. 77% had a history of using cocaine. So this, I argue, and a lot of people who agree with me argue, that you're going after the wrong target. You're targeting doctors treating patients in pain. This has always been a population of people accessing drugs for non-medical reasons in the black market. It's been there from the beginning. And in New York, when OxyContin became more available for diversion, because as it got prescribed more, and oxycodone and hydrocodone, because we had overcome our opiophobia, and we were prescribing more, the more that's prescribed and the more that's produced, the more that's available to get diverted into the black market. So that became the popular way for people who wanted to get high for non-medical reasons to get high. And you hear policymakers all the time saying, you know, the majority of people who are heroin addicts say they started on OxyContin or oxycodone or prescription opioids, they'll say. Well, that implies that the doctor prescribed opioids.
That's only half true because of how they got there. Of course.
Right. It may be that's how the majority started, but it wasn't because the doctor prescribed it for me. It's because a typical story would be, you know, you're in college and your friends are getting high on a Friday night after school. One of your friends said, "Hey, I got this stuff called OxyContin. You want to try it? It gives you a great buzz."
Sure.
And that led that person to maybe on to
I want to get to that point. I think that's so important because and we'll talk about the black market, but the black market doesn't mean going into a dark alley now. The black market means, you know, casually friends are at the party and you want to try one of those pills, which, by the way, I got from somewhere else. And that's such an important point. So I think that's a very, very risky behavior. I'm not sure the lay public at large knows that. Right?
We go back to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. This is the government.
Sure.
75% or more of non-medical users say that they got their drugs from a family member, friend, or dealer. Less than 25% said they went to a doctor.
Sure.
And out of those, they didn't necessarily go to a doctor because they really needed it.
Sure.
And they got it to fake an illness and get a prescription so they could get high. So this is, I argue, always been basically people, non-medical users in the black market. Meanwhile, because of those unscrupulous, unethical doctors, that's almost became imprinted in the minds of policymakers. And that plus there's no question there's been an increase in that prescribing of opioids. And I'm sure, as a doctor, you know, there may be some doctors who we would disagree that maybe they prescribe too liberally. But let's talk about the safety of this.
I was going to ask you about that because I think just for the sake of our audience, particularly those that are physicians, it should be first so clear. Everyone advocates for responsible prescribing, right? Just the right amount, the right doses. But so that goes without saying, and I think the whole thing with the bad apples is a very, very important perspective. It's a contributing factor, maybe even more before, but less so now. But I think let's talk about the safety, which is where I mean I was going to ask you about the lethal dose of some of this medications, and you know, how much would you have to take to?
It's interesting if you look this up. You find the median lethal dose of OxyContin is 100 milligrams per kilogram in a rat.
Wow.
Yeah.
How many pills is
An
that?
80 kilogram man, that's 8,000 10 milligram pills, right?
Right. That's
No, it's 810 milligram.
That's 800 pills. Yes, it's just astonishing amount of.
And for Vicodin or hydrocodone, the median lethal dose is 375 milligrams per kilogram.
Mm-hmm.
So that's huge. That's a huge amount you need to take. But here's an interesting thing. The among the studies used by the CDC guidelines on opioid use, and that all of the regulators cite when states are now imposing these prescription restrictions on doctors, saying they don't want you to prescribe more than 90 morphine milligram equivalents per day, and they're putting all these 5-day supply, all these kind of limits.
Sure.
They base this on a very good study done by Amy Bonner at the VA hospital. She's at the University of Michigan. And in 2011, they studied a huge population of VA patients, and they concluded that it's almost intuitive anyway. The higher the dose, the more likely you are to overdose. Which, by the way, even that's not clear. But what they failed to notice in the study is, despite those findings, so they just focused on the higher the dose, the greater the likelihood of overdose. But the rest of the study said the total overdose rate was 0.04%.
Mm-hmm.
So it's true that the higher the dose, the more likely you are to overdose. But you're also telling me it almost doesn't happen that you overdose.
Sure.
And then in the University of North Carolina, Dans Gupta and others did a study. They followed all North Carolina residents prescribed opioids in the year 2015. They had 2.2 million residents prescribed opioids.
Wow.
And they found a total overdose rate of 0.022%. So it's actually, by the way, in their study, 61% of those overdoses had multiple other drugs on board, like benzodiazepines or alcohol. So
I was going to ask you that because there's, in my mind, from what I've learned from you, there's two concepts that are often lost. One is it's a more potent opioids that, and we'll get to that, the fentanyl and the heroin. But number two is a polypharmacy, right? So they're combining, and at the end of the day, a lot of this has to do with respiratory depression, benzodiazepines.
It's usually respiratory depression.
Plus, that's kind of you make that be happening in a party where there's this, lots of alcohol being consumed. So that's part of the recipe
Right.
to this disaster.
Well, yeah. In fact, New York City Health Department, which keeps really good health statistics, in 2016, it's the most recent year they have data for. They found that, first of all, 75% of the opioid overdoses in New York City in 2016, and we got to get back to this,
Yes.
was heroin and fentanyl. But it was 97% of the overdoses in New York City in 2016 had multiple drugs on board. 97%.
So almost 100%
Yeah, almost
of
everybody. And
So,
46% of the overdose victims were found to have cocaine in their system. So again, we got this narrative that people are dying because these doctors are getting patients hooked on opioids, and they're making us cut back on patients who
legitimately
these
need opioids.
And there are a lot of patients who are now
Sure.
getting cut off and they're desperate.
Sure.
And doctors are afraid to prescribe because they don't want to get arrested as operating criminals, so they're sending them to pain management people to let them handle it. And the pain management people, they're getting swamped and they can't.
Do we even have enough people who can do
No,
this?
no, and they're getting swamped, and everybody's getting paranoid. And there's a lot of evidence now that people, in desperation, they turn to the black market, where you don't know what you're getting. So they think they're getting hydrocodone, but instead it's actually fentanyl that's been camouflaged. That's how Prince, by the way, we learned recently, he died. They said he died of an opioid overdose, but now we found that in investigating further, he never once went to a doctor for a prescription.
Never once. Wow.
And he liked to abuse Vicodin or hydrocodone. That was his favorite drug.
Wow.
So he went to the black market, and now fentanyl is flooding this country. It usually comes in through the mail and through
The standard
FedEx.
mail, that's just
Yeah.
incredible. It doesn't come in any,
And they keep making new analogs, and then there are dealers who have pill presses,
Sure.
and they're pressing them into pills and selling on the street as oxycodone or hydrocodone. He thought he was buying Vicodin, and it turns out he overdosed on fentanyl.
If there's one point I would like for people to get out of this video, is just precisely that, the risk of that, because, from what I understand, so they get fentanyl overseas, they just mix it with some form of powder that works as a CBP. They actually buy the casts, which have the exact same shape and number of a pill. So even if you're a physician and family member shows you, I have this Vicodin, you might go and check the number and say, yeah, that looks like Vicodin, go ahead and take it. But how that happens, and this is really a tragic story, you have maybe some kids and they have money, or someone like Prince, they have a driver. Hey, can you get us some pills? They don't even have to go to the underworld. They just get us some pills. The driver comes back, gets some pills. Turns out they look like Vicodin, but in fact is fentanyl mixed with something else, which at doses that we don't even know. How
it's
well
useful
they're.
for us doctors to know because if a patient says I have some Vicodin in the house,
Sure.
I use that instead of you writing me a prescription. You probably ought to ask them, is that from a prescription from a doctor that
Sure.
you got, or did you just get that from someone?
I've told my sons and family members, never ever take anything unless you see it directly come out of the window. Just because of this. I mean, the story of Prince is actually remarkable.
It happens over and over again.
Sure.
So that's the point. The point is they think we're doing this, but this has always been non-medical uses. Typical stories of people are introduced to these drugs, and now what's happened is because of the drop in prescriptions that was basically instituted by government policies, the fear also of a lot of patients. We have patients unnecessarily going back to suffering again. We have other patients who are cut off and desperate. Some are committing. There's a lot of documented cases of them committing suicide. I hope none of us ever know the pain that could drive you to want to end your life rather than experience any more pain. That's how bad it is. But there are people doing that. A lot of documented cases of that. And meanwhile, the overdose rate continues to climb. And now, roughly 2/3 of the time, it's with either heroin or fentanyl. And so all we've managed to do is by cutting off reducing the amount of prescription-type opioids that can be diverted to the black market for non-medical users to use. The drug dealers have basically filled that space with their stuff, with heroin, fentanyl, and it's flooding the place. And so we've taken the same population of people who are non-medical users, and we've just made sure that they use more dangerous stuff so that they die.
Sure.
And that's what we're doing.
Well, plus, the cost of production is low for something like fentanyl. They can do it. The quality control, who knows? You can sneak a lot in a small amount too as well. And as you said, some of that comes through the mail, and that's why it becomes
Some
such
of
a
it's
problem.
being used, according to the DEA knows a lot about this, and they've been discussing this. The majority of fentanyl, they say, that's on the streets, it's almost all comes in smuggled in. There's almost none that was diverted from the medical use, because most of the fentanyl that we would prescribe to patients in an ambulatory setting, like the fentanyl patch or maybe the lozenge, I mean, you could abuse them, but it's not very practical for non-medical use. It's much easier just to get the powder and inject it or make a pill.
At hospitals, I don't know if you've seen this, have rooms that are called diversion prevention. So again, just trying to tackle things from
everything's locked up. Prescriptions are locked up.
And we all agree with that. That has to be managed carefully. But again, if we want to have an impact, we have to look at the root cause of this. Now, you create this umbrella or this bucket to talk about trying to attack this from the supply side, and I think that's you and I agree that's the wrong thing. And I think one of the very, very insightful comments you've made is, can we achieve a drug-free society? And that's really problematic because, it just seems to me that the war on drugs is not taking us anywhere. I mean, if anything, as someone who has, family in Mexico, has created tremendous suffering and pain and death. And to an extreme,
and so
many
countries in Latin America more than us.
What are the gains?
Disrupting
What are we getting out of that? And I know one of the great examples, for instance, is Portugal. What they did with the management of the decriminalizing the drug use. How would you envision that working?
What you're talking about, first off, is the principle of harm reduction. And the philosophy of harm reduction is it accepts the fact that you're never going to achieve a drug-free society. That's, as long as they're going to be humans, they're going to be people wanting to alter their consciousness for one reason or another. It could be to escape issues like
maybe incredibly primitive. That animals, mammals in nature, they go and eat things that are fermented apples, for instance. Alcohol type things. There's some intrinsic behavior to the brain.
I mean, the history of alcohol.
Sure.
Alcoholic beverages goes back millennia.
Sure.
In all societies. So, but besides that, so it basically says instead of trying to impose our will on society, let's just, it's not being judgmental one way or the other. It's saying our goal should be that we want to see less people hurt themselves, less people die.
Sure.
So harm reduction techniques involve things like needle exchange programs so you're not spreading HIV and hepatitis. Better yet, supervised injection facilities so that when you're in the facility injecting, the people there discard your needle and syringe so you don't get to go share it once you're out in the street. Plus, there's somebody around with naloxone in case you overdose. There's been a lot of success in multiple advanced countries with heroin-assisted treatment instead of methadone or buprenorphine, which is also a time-tested form of medication-assisted treatment. For those people that it doesn't work for, there seems to be a second population who fail those and do well with heroin-assisted treatment because heroin, again, supervised injection. It's been started in 1994 in Switzerland. That was in Germany, Canada, the UK, Denmark, Belgium.
Sure.
Andalusia, they have a center like that. So these are harm reduction measures. We're not necessarily endorsing what you're doing, but we're saying at least don't hurt yourself. Now, in Portugal, in 2001, and if you look at the directors of the program, the people who came up with it, they said that they looked at this approach as their efforts to decrease drug use. They didn't look at it as throwing, because critics say you just threw in the towel. They say, no, actually, we felt that the methods that we've been employing for the last close to 100 years have not worked, so let's try, maybe this will work.
They're watching unfolding the towel, because it seems to me they're making quite a bit more progress. I mean, the data is in favor of all of that, right?
Yeah, because at that time, in 2001, Portugal had the highest overdose rate in Western Europe. And so they thought of this as an approach, and they totally decriminalized all drugs, totally.
What's the difference between decriminalize and that they're legal? And I think that's an important distinction.
Because actually, ideally, we should have legalized.
Sure.
With decriminalized, but politically, decriminalized is much easier to attain because with decriminalized, is basically saying it's technically it's still against the law. So heroin use against the law, cocaine, but we're not going to arrest anybody. We're not going to punish anybody. They still in Portugal, if they big scale drug smugglers are still interdicted and arrested. But street users, small time street dealers, there's no penalty, no punishment.
Sure.
And all of the efforts that had been, and all the funding that had gone into law enforcement has gone into expanding harm reduction programs. And what they found is that as drug users were no longer afraid that they'll be accused of committing a crime and get arrested, a lot of them who wanted help have come forward. In addition, they have kind of like what people call nudging. So if you're found in possession of one of these drugs, you can get like a little traffic ticket kind of fine, very minimal fine. But that'll be waived if you decide you want to go into a rehab program. But you can't be forced. So that was in 2001. The latest data shows that they now have the lowest overdose rate in Europe. In fact,
the lowest overdose rate.
They have 6 opioid overdose deaths per million. The United States has 312 per million. We're among the highest.
50 times as much. Wow.
And they've had a 75% reduction of heroin addicts. They had, it was a small country, they had documented 100,000 heroin addicts in 2001. In the most recent data, they have 25,000 known heroin addicts. And they have safe injection rooms for them and supervised injection facilities, etc. So it's such a success that the Norwegian legislature just voted to implement the same program.
I saw that. That's
fantastic. And the disadvantage of the criminals, the advantage is obviously, we see the advantage. Sure. Just in terms of you're not filling our prisons. Remember, most people who have substance abuse problems, these are not bad people. That's another thing we tend to look at as a vice. It's an illness. It's a disease. These could be, our sons and daughters, our brothers and sisters. These are decent people who have an actual problem, but we've been treating them like criminals and destroying their lives in the process. So when suddenly they're not looked at that way, and they don't feel afraid to talk about it and come forth, more people get help, and we find we have less use. But when it's just decriminalized, you still are getting this stuff on the black market. So we go back to the story of Prince. You
Sure.
think you're buying hydrocodone or Vicodin, you're buying fentanyl. You don't know.
He did have some previous episodes, Prince,
Yeah.
where there were some similar episodes before he actually died, and I presume he was taking similar pills from the same
Most of
supplier.
it, yeah.
So one of the critical points that you say is harm reduction. So we should change our focus not from less opioid prescribing, but really from less opioid related deaths.
Exactly. That should be the focus.
And that should be.
And we're right to be alarmed about the death rate.
Mhm.
So let's focus on having less people die, not on less people.
And if you were to do a right click on that word opioid, you would, currently what's happening is more the fentanyl and the heroin,
Yeah.
and all what's coming through the black market. Now, I think it would be a challenge in this country to envision a situation where we had decriminalization of drugs, at least for the foreseeable future. And I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, "Traditions, you don't throw them out the window, but you take them one step at a time down the stair." And there's a good number of strategies that could be implemented now with minimal effort, with no political capital being spent, that would result in harm reduction. And
Right.
you've talked about some of this.
Right. We don't have to, for example, in the rest of the EU, they haven't decriminalized drugs, with the exception of cannabis in some countries. Yet they have, and by the way, they have an opioid overdose problem in Europe as well.
Mhm.
It's not as bad as ours.
That's the point I wanted to ask you. Is that exclusive to the United States? And your point is no.
And it's the same. It's the same distribution. It seems to be mostly heroin and fentanyl now. And European physicians, culturally, have always been much more frugal in their prescription of opioids. They expect more stoicism from their patients. So it's not, you can't connect it to prescription numbers there. Even in those countries, even if they haven't gone as far as Portugal, those countries have been very liberal in their employing harm reduction programs. So that, for example, Switzerland has decriminalized drugs, but they were the first to come up with these heroin-assisted treatment programs that have been very successful, started in Zurich in 1994. Germany has that. They've had a strong emphasis on medication-assisted treatment like methadone, buprenorphine, and safe syringe. It's amazing. The American Medical Association, the CDC, and the Surgeon General all openly endorse the development in this country of what they call supervised injection facilities, which critics call shooting galleries.
Sure.
And we're the only country in the developed world that doesn't have it. There's several of them throughout Europe, Australia, UK,
And there's
Canada.
all the other health benefits we're not even covering. Hepatitis C,
Yeah.
HIV, clean needle use. Plus this nudging. I think one of the questions I wanted to ask you is that, and this goes certainly beyond my realm of expertise, but is what we're seeing a phenomenon of something deeper going on in society? I mean, you see the increase in the number of suicides, and some people have questioned, is it a crisis of meaning for some people too as well? There's all sorts of
I
questions that
suspect
go
that.
beyond my
Yeah,
expertise.
me too, but I suspect that we've seen suicides are up 30%, I think, since the beginning of the century.
Sure. Highly
Something's
accomplished
happening.
people that would have resources, access, means, seemingly happy, and then there's that void. Very, very notable recent, for instance, episodes of suicide, which makes one wonder.
And I think can't help but think there's a connection. If you talk to heroin addicts, a lot of them tell you, or drug addicts, a lot of them tell you it helps them escape the pain of whatever it is that they're psychologically demonizing them. Reason TV did a documentary recently, a few weeks ago, that I actually had the pleasure of being interviewed for. And it was a fascinating interview with a heroin addict who's she's now gone through rehab and she's off the heroin right now. She seemed very intelligent, had a great amount of insight into herself, and she said that she was sexually molested when she was a teenager. And at first she was just trying to kind of sweep it under the rug, and then she found when her boyfriend introduced her to heroin that when you take it, it's like you have no feelings about anything else at all. Nothing else matters. You don't really care about anything.
Mhm.
And so for her, it was a way of her not having to deal with all these terrible suppressed conflicts that were eating at her because she felt nothing. It's a way of numbing herself. Now that's her story. I'm sure that's not everybody's
I'm sure
story.
everyone.
But in modern society, we're seeing the drug problem not just in the United States, but in Europe, and Australia, and we're seeing the suicide rates go up. I think it's very complicated. It's very nuanced. There's no simple explanation
Sure.
or one explanation. But unfortunately, people in policy like one simple explanation with one simple solution. And that's how they tend to approach things.
Sure. I think others in those fields need to help us navigate through that complexity. Before I move on, I just want to go back to harm reduction. The other one you've mentioned before is a Good Samaritan laws. That seems to me that's a no-brainer. Every state should have that. I think that's very compassionate. People can be helped, and can you expand on that a little bit?
I think like 47 or 48 states have it now. Arizona recently passed one, but you got to be careful on how those are worded. So, Good Samaritan law basically is, let's say you're in an alleyway with your friend shooting heroin, and your friend overdoses, and you want to call 911 because you're afraid your friend's going to die. Well, you're afraid to because you're going to get arrested for doing heroin. So, these laws say if you need to call help, you will be held immune. Don't worry about it. We're not going to arrest you. We're just going to show up and help your friend. So don't be afraid to call because we want to save your friend's life. And in almost every place in the country now, first responders are equipped with naloxone to rescue these people. And I think it's a great idea. Unfortunately, you got to be careful how these laws are worded. So in some states, there are sort of loopholes. So for example, in Florida, there have been a number of incidents where when the first responders showed up, if the overdose victim died, they arrested the person who called them for second-degree manslaughter.
Wow.
In Arizona, the law that was recently passed has loopholes where you could be arrested for other related, non-drug related offenses if they're outstanding warrants or something like that. And a lot of people who are in this part of the world may have other arrest warrants. So that discourages. It's counterproductive because in the underground community, one or two of those things happen and word's going to spread fast and everyone's going to call for help.
See, and I think the problem is that it's more than the laws, it's actually the dissemination about the laws. I bet you if you and I go out in the street and start asking people, do they know about Good Samaritan laws for opioids? I'd be surprised if 1 in 10 knows that, probably much less than that. And the reality is what we need is people that know that they will be held harmless if they're trying to help someone else. And more so since we start from that concept of them being associated with illness.
It's the same thing with naloxone.
Absolutely.
That's been another problem.
Absolutely.
So naloxone's been around since 1971, and it's obviously approved for use by lay people. We have experience with lay people properly using it, like paramedics, firemen, police, and because it's categorized as a prescription drug, most people have been unable to get it. So the states have come up with workarounds. I think, there are 3 states that still have it, 3 or 4, Hawaii, Wyoming, and a couple of others. I think Maine's another one. But for the most part, what states have done is either their state director of health, who's a doctor, issues a standing order, basically saying all pharmacists are hereby ordered by me as a prescription
to
give it to the person who comes to the counter wanting it. Or in other cases, what they've done is since the FDA's definition of prescription-only drug is that it's a drug that can only be prescribed by a healthcare provider licensed by the state, and pharmacists are among the list of healthcare providers, then it's a scope of practice issue. So a lot of states have just designated that pharmacists can prescribe it. So they've kind of made it the closest thing possible to over-the-counter.
I see.
But it's not perfect. For number one, people don't know about it for the most part, including a lot of pharmacies. There was a recent report in the New York newspaper, New York Times, that the mayor of New York's wife was upset to find out that several pharmacies in New York City didn't even know that they could provide it to people who came up to the pharmacist to ask for it.
Wow.
So word hasn't got it. And then some pharmacists, for personal reasons, they don't want to give it to them because they feel they're enabling their addiction. So meanwhile,
so there's an element of judgment in that.
Right. And meanwhile, the FDA in 2016, the deputy director of the FDA in a blog post said, this is probably suitable to be over the counter, and we invite manufacturers to make an application to switch to over the counter. We'll even help them with the application process.
Okay.
But none have done so, and you know why? Because I don't think there's an economic incentive
to
be over the counter.
Wow.
But if you look at the regulations carefully, that's not the only way a drug can be classified as over the counter. The commissioner could also order a review for reclassification, and so can, according to the regulations, any interested person. So there's nothing that prevents the Surgeon General or the governor of the state or a legislature from requesting a review to reclassify. Meanwhile, Australia, because of this problem, decided to make it over the counter. And it's over the counter in Italy for over 20 years. If it was over the counter, truly over the counter, people can, it won't take long for the word to spread on that. You could just go buy it off the shelf like you buy, a bottle of Tums or something like that, or Band-Aids, and check out at the counter, and nobody has to know, because this way it's your private business. Because a lot of people, even who know about it now, are afraid to go up to a pharmacist because we created such a new opiophobia, a new stigma attached to people. People are afraid to even let other people know they're using opioids, even if they're using it under a doctor's supervision, because of the new stigma we've recreated on it. So they don't want to go and say to a pharmacist, "I'd like some naloxone, please." And then in some states, they don't allow third parties to get prescriptions.
Okay.
In some states. So, for example, let's say you have a family member you know has a problem, and you'd like to have naloxone around
handy.
in case one day you come home and see you have to use it. Well, in certain states you can't buy it. It has to be that person who buys it. So that's why another thing we could do that should be like low-hanging fruit is have the FDA, who's already on record is saying this is probably suitable for reclassification. Then don't wait for the pharmaceutical manufacturers to ask you. Start the process.
I see the letter from Dr. Singer going to Commissioner Gottlieb saying we got to do this.
For what it's worth, I'm an interested person and I'm asking.
We need to do that. I know we could go on for a long time, but let me just finish with one last question for you. I see this as potentially controversial. The fifth vital sign.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's being used a little bit as a scapegoat right now.
Yeah.
Because anyone who cares for patients, you walk into a room and you see a grimacing face, there's a need to be addressed. And, like any other vital signs is one of the metrics we use. I guess one could argue the other ones are immediately life-threatening, whether you stop breathing or you have, not a heart rate, so to speak. But it's still a very important metric. So whether it's called the fifth vital sign or not, it's a little bit maybe semantics on whether it's a vital sign or not. But I think it's really, really important.
I agree.
And so what are your thoughts on that?
It really disturbs me that growing out of this false idea that all of these overdoses are due to us addicting our patients. They then went and said, well, you guys decided to make it the fifth vital sign around the beginning of the century. See, that was you. You started this whole thing. And you hear people saying that. Again,
Sure.
Not only is it not does not comport with any of the evidence, but the fact is, all of that evidence leading up to our relaxation or liberalization of prescribing opioids, that was still good evidence. The evidence had always been that we were under-medicating our patients in pain, under-treating pain, and that given in a medical setting, there's a very low risk for overdose and a very low risk for true addiction. If people become dependent, that's something we could handle as clinicians and always do. And if we're doctors, one of the reasons we do this is because we want to ease suffering. That's part of our mission. So we should be inquiring about the level of pain our patients are having. We shouldn't suddenly adopt this attitude of, get it like Attorney General Sessions is, take an aspirin.
It's the lay media is disturbing. Sometimes, and you probably saw the article in the New York Times. The Germans, they do better. They are fine with ibuprofen. It's like, what kind of messaging is that? That's just inconsistent with the benevolence attitude that we should
have. But they have an
medicine.
overdose problem also.
As well, too, of course.
That's why they have harm reduction programs, which is probably a reason why their overdose rate isn't as dramatic as ours.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, you're very, very gracious. Thank you for giving us your time. I know you're a sought-after figure. BBC, NPR, any news station around the country is looking for your time, and I was able to get an hour of your time here. So I'm thankful. This is an important message. I know you and I feel very strongly about this, and thank you for your attention. I hope you found this helpful, and I look forward to seeing you at the next episode of Innovation in Medicine. Thank you.
Thank you very much.